My name is Toms Baumanis and I'm chairman of LATO. This is really great day for us. We are having a Riga conference again, and I'm so happy to welcome all of you here today. We are having two very exciting days ahead of us, a very distinguished panel with two prime ministers. We started this conference almost 8 years ago, and that time we focused much on security and NATO, and that was about when Riga NATO summit took place. This year, conference is meant to focus more on Europe, and we have done some preparations on this together with our partner, German Marshall Fund of United States. We have gathered a working group and prepared some thinking and some material for you to review. So let me bring your attention to this book, which is in everyone's folder. It's about 4 scenarios for Europe. And I guess or hope this will be food for us these coming 2 days. With this short introduction, again, I want to thank you. And Silke, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me apologize for this short delay we have here, but I'm pretty sure that you will be compensated by a very interesting and lively discussion. I have the pleasure to introduce a very exciting panel here, not only because there are 2 prime ministers on it, and I'll start from left to right, and I gladly start with the prime minister of the host country we are in, Valdis Dombrovskis, who is not only a splendid economist, but also had studied physics. And I was curious to know, staying in the Albert Hotel, where we read a lot of quotes by Albert Einstein, whether he could come up with a very elegant short formula for European growth. Welcome, Prime Minister. We have Zoran Milanović next to him, Prime Minister of Croatia, and that's a specific pleasure to have him here as the newest member of the EU. Welcome again in both cases, which basically gave us dyed-in-the-wool Europeans great hope, because the enthusiasm with which Croatia has pursued its membership of the EU really gave us hope. We have Yves Leterme, who after many important posts, including Prime Minister in Belgium, is since 2011 Deputy Secretary General of the OECD. Welcome. And we have Yannos Papantoniou, who's now President of the Center for Progressive Policy Research and former Economy and Finance Minister of Greece. And you were the one responsible seeing Greece into the Eurozone. And also, I've just read an article by you in Foreign Affairs, April this year, I believe, where you again explain as to why that was the right step to do. If you look at it a bit different, you could say what we have here is the Prime Minister of a country that remarkably well did its homework. We have the Prime Minister of a country who also remarkably well did its homework to get into the EU, and will probably have to do one more. We have a former finance minister of a country who has been given a lot of homework these days, and we basically have one who has to oversee all of this homework. So welcome again to all of you. And perhaps, Mr. Dombrovskis, you would like to start with a short statement. After the statements from the panel, we of course go straight into the Q&A session here in this room, because I can imagine that you have tons of questions. And we'll also get some questions from outside, because this session, like most of the other plenary sessions, will be followed live stream. So we might get some of us. I just hope that I get the technology right here, and we might get some questions from young leaders sitting in another room. Mr. Dombrovskis, if I may ask you to start with your statement. How can we get Europe into growth? How do we make it a European player again? How do we raise international competitiveness?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank organizers of Riga Conference, LATO, Toms Baumanis personally for the continuous work they are doing, actually turning Riga Conference into a traditional and prominent regional forum to discuss a number of issues. And while initially Riga Conference was probably more dealing with foreign and security policy issues, we know that the scope is also broadening, because quite often discussing those topics you actually cannot avoid economy. And here we are again discussing economy and also finding its links with foreign and security policies. So to come back to this question and how it was formulated, so how can we make Europe a global player again? First of all, I'd like to say that Europe is a global player, and there's no doubt about this. EU 28 is the world's biggest economy. Euro is one of the very few global currencies. Around a quarter of global reserves are being held in euros, for example. So quite clear that Europe is a global player. So basically what we should look is what are the current issues in Europe, what are the current issues in EU, in Eurozone, and what needs to be done to address those issues. And in this regard, it's often presented as a sovereign debt crisis. Well, Europe has accumulated public debt, which is probably behind its safe levels, which is causing financial markets to worry about certain countries' position to repay this debt and to actually deal with these financial and economical problems we are facing right now. But then again, if we are to look at other global players, we see the somewhat different picture. If you look at the public debt figures, in Japan it's well over 200% of GDP, 230 something. In US it's somewhat about 100% of GDP, 106 or so. In Europe it's around 90% of GDP. So, and then the question could be, so how comes financial markets have decided to worry about Europe with 90% of GDP public debt and not to worry about US with more than 100% or not to worry about Japan with more than 200% of GDP public debt? So apparently it's not only the sovereign debt crisis we're facing right now. There is something else in this equation which made Europe being singled out. And this something else seems to be competitiveness. And so probably what Europe is facing right now, it's a competitiveness crisis, and those are exactly the issues which need to be dealt with. And in terms of this competitiveness, so what we can do, we can assess what are the competitiveness factors, in which factors we are lagging behind other global players, and what we need to do to address those competitiveness factors. And then we see a number of factors which need to be addressed nationally, and to mention some of those factors is two factors where we clearly, on average, lag behind the US is labor market efficiency and research and development. And in this, pictures are quite mixed in different countries. So it's quite clear that quite a few EU countries need to address this labor market efficiency issue, deal with labor market reforms, research and development. Again, among other things, US is just outspending us on this, so it's quite clear that we need to concentrate more on also research and development spending, but they're also doing a better job in terms of transferring this academical knowledge into practically applicable innovation. And that's something we also should look, how do we actually move the academic knowledge into real economy. So those are the two aspects which certainly need to be paid attention to. Then there are a couple of things which can be done at the EU level. And first and foremost, it's a full utilization of the potential of the EU internal market. Because while it's functioning relatively well in terms of goods, in services, it's far from complete. There are European Commission estimates, for example, that full implementation of Services Directive would bring another 2.6% to EU GDP. Digital single market, well, we do not have digital single market, and we are lagging behind other global players also in this. So far we have 28 different digital markets, something we need to address again. And again, there are estimates that, for example, 15% increase in a digital retail would add another 1.7% to EU GDP. Issues of administrative burden, of red tape, of SME support, access to credit, something which needs to be addressed right now and which is being addressed at least partly with the initiatives to deal with a banking union, because this is another aspect now with our financial and economical crisis. Can we ensure creditless recovery? And the answer is probably not, because there had been studies, been done some studies on this. And while there are historically quite a few creditless recoveries, they are typically with countries with much lower income levels and typically after successful devaluations, which will not be the case with euro. So really we need to do with this banking union initiatives actually to break this link between banks and sovereigns, because so far we are in a somewhat vicious cycle that fragile banks are hurt by fragile sovereigns, which are in turn hurt by fragile banks. And this link needs to be severed, and we need to actually return the real credit to the economy if we are to sustain stable economic growth. So, in short, there are no miracle solutions. But there are certain competitiveness factors we can measure, we can identify the problems, and we can work to address those competitiveness factors. And by doing so, we definitely can return EU to the growth. And while returning EU to the growth, it's much easier to deal also with fiscal and financial problems. So, to summarize, well, EU is still a global player and is going to be a global player, there's no doubt about this. We also see that EU has still a significant soft power, and EU has its EU is acting as a magnet. Countries are still interested to join the EU. Croatia joined a couple of months before. There are quite a few other countries negotiating EU accession. There are countries interested to join Eurozone. Latvia is about to join in a couple of months. There are other countries which are interested. So basically we should not be also overly down-talking ourselves that we are not a global player anymore and so on. If you look at the figures, if you look at the facts, that's absolutely not the case. There are issues which need to be addressed, so let's address them and let's return to the growth and sustained development again.
I like the fact that we hear some very optimistic words in the beginning. That's a great opening. And I'm sure, Mr. Milanović, you could add a few of them, because actually there were good reasons, very good reasons for Croatia to join the European Union. But perhaps, building on what Mr. Dombrovskis said just right now, perhaps you might want to deal with these factors that we've been hearing now about how to stimulate growth here, how to make the European Union more competitive from the view of Croatia.
Hello, everybody. It's been 10 years since my foot set here last time for another LATO conference. It was fall 2003, and I was greeted by the same dear face of Toms Baumanis, who at the time also was the chairman. So I'm happy to be here now to speak about the obstacles that get in the way of Europe being competitive and strong from Croatian perspective, and tutoring Germany, England, or France in that respect would be pretentious to say the least. But I can share some thoughts of mine with you.
We call it sharing, not tutoring.
The economy, what makes economy and economic activity as a human activity so exciting and is exactly its unpredictability. And no matter how much you apply some scientific norms and standards, science it isn't. It's just the most glorious, the biggest, the most motivating human activity. And strict predictions are simply impossible. Now, Europe is the best place to live for me. It's a combination of rich, still competitive, global economies, but also decent place to live, where some norms, standards are respected and really taken by heart. Those quality of life, that quality of life matters. So I could never trade Europe for America as a living space of mine. There is no clear-cut rule. We still recall clearly and vividly 10 years ago, whoever was the frequent reader of the so splendid journals like Economist and Financial Times, that Germany was time and again labeled as a laggard of Europe, sick man of Europe, not being able to spur competition, to spur growth, to motivate consumption internally. Now we see what came to pass. Germany did change at the time. It had its own recipe at the time. However, at the cost, because to be German worker these days is not the same as it was 25 years ago, when being a mechanic with a BMW equaled earnings of medical doctor. The labor unit cost in Germany all but stagnated over the last 15 years. So it all came with a cost. And that's the cost that Germany was determined, or its leaders were determined to pay. And it was minted in that kind of spirit. Now Latvia was both blessed and cursed some years ago. Cursed to have such a sinister, gross slump of the economy in 1 year that nobody could predict, not even the smartest economists, who could have ever reckoned of economy dropping 18%. But then again, blessed because it spurred Latvia to take bold measures, and these are often the most effective ones. So difficult, sinister situation kind of served as a catalyst for Latvia to change. So change she did. Some years later, Latvia was in that kind of disaster, lucky to be in this region, because this is the region of the Nordics. The economies that have changed, adapted, and made themselves time and again world competitive some years ago. So it's easier to grow and thrive in this environment, plus Russia, which is a growing economy. And Latvia is, hell-bent on being open, transparent, competitive, export-driven economy. Croatia, small country, small economy. In terms of population, double Latvia's size, but it's still within the error of statistical margin, the margin worldwide, was both blessed and cursed. Blessed not to have such a dramatic slump, but then again cursed because it didn't serve as a ringing bell to us. We should have changed some 5 years ago. And then in addition, to add, not insult to injury, but to aggravate the situation more, our main trading partners are actually among the biggest laggards of Europe these years. Italy, so important, relevant to us, to all Croatian exports. Slovenia these days, Hungary, so the countries that we heavily rely upon in our exchange. So there is no single rule. We see throughout Europe that different economies play by different rules, are led by different leaders. What Europe has to, in my opinion, and that's what I'm gonna pull the brake for the time. So we need to set the clear rules of what the Europe is, because this policy of procrastination or permanent self-introspection of what we are, where we stand, how do we matter, is not productive. So we have to decide what is the kind of cooperation we wish. Is that a banking union? I say yes, from my political perspective. Is that a federation? I say no. We didn't go for that. We didn't go for that. Is that a more internal market? Yes, it is. Is that a final and definite framework of the treaties of Europe? I think it's been about time. America did it 250 years ago, and it's pretty much the same legal framework exists these days. It was not all the time that helpful and conducive to development. It led to civil war, but once it was established, it's there, and it works. So the permanent change is good in economy, but in politics and relations between states, it creates kind of instability and the situation that you cannot predict. So we need a clear set of rules, institutional rules. Know where we stand, or where do we go from there. And as far as particular countries are concerned, I cannot bring any recipe for Latvia. You know the best. So I say you've been both cursed and blessed. But you were bold enough to change. And of course, you led as politicians. But people didn't simply follow. They apparently subscribed to that policy. So in that respect, you're really blessed.
Let me throw in a quick question here as the editor of a German magazine. That's 2 for banking union. Do you expect Germany to push hard for a banking union after the election, no matter who will be in government?
Again, it would be pretentious for me to forecast, political, internal nitty-gritty of German politics. I don't know. I think...
Well, but we can read continuities, we can read pattern of behavior, of political actions.
I've seen Chancellor Merkel...
Do you expect Germany to push hard for a banking union, and do you think they follow up on this?
Well, any push by Germany is, by definition, hard push. So if Germany stands for that, it's going to matter, Simply the calamities that we've been through some months and years ago should not come to pass again. We should learn some lessons from that. And what will be the German stance? But the good thing, you asked me about political forecast and political psychology, or what certain people would decide provided they win the elections. Again, I reiterate, I do not know, but Merkel has been quite consistent in his policy, and actually, on the other hand, she followed the path that has been set in Germany some 10 years ago. And
Thanks.
Sometimes it's simply smart not to touch things that work well.
Thank you. Mr. Leterme, just forgive me for jumping the queue for a moment, because I thought from Latvia to Croatia, we jumped to Greece, and then we have an OECD look at it. So, Mr. Papantoniou, if you'd take up the question first as to, from your perspective, and probably really also from a very Greece perspective, what has to be done to make Greece, and with Greece also Europe, more competitive?
Could you repeat the last part of your question?
With Greece, I mean, it's important that Greece will be on board. That's for sure. I think we can all agree on this. So the question would be, what would you emphasize for making Greece and then also the European Union more competitive? Because this obviously is the core question here.
Sure. Well, the first point I wish to make is that I do not share really the optimism of the previous speakers so far as the strength of the European Union as a global player. Of course, it is a global player, because if you compare the EU with the United States, it is equal in size. However, it is on a declining trend. Growth rates have been lower than the US for 20 years. The recession is very deep. And now, after the eruption of the debt crisis, you see that in the south of Europe, not only Greece, but Italy, Spain, Portugal, we do have depression of wartime proportions. Let me remind you that unemployment in Greece and Spain is approaching 30%, while young people is 65%, 2 out of 3. Young people in Spain and Greece cannot find a job, and Greece has lost 25% of its output in the course of the last 5 years, which is equal to what we lost during the Second World War. So this is a very depressing outlook. It does not affect only Greece. Italy and Portugal have similar bad performance. So the question is not only a national problem, what Greece should do, or what Italy should do. Of course, national efforts are extremely important, but also it's a question of the Eurozone as a whole, which has failed as a system because it has been constructed on a basis which is not very solid. So what should be done? First of all, it is obvious that the individual countries themselves, which is Greece and Portugal and Spain and Portugal, should do their homework, which is austerity to redress their fiscal balances and structural reforms to become more competitive. In fact, on both these counts, progress has been uneven. Fiscal progress has been somewhat more important, more substantial and successful, structural reforms less. But let us, taking that into account, that the progress in the individual countries has been uneven, look at what the Eurozone should do, because, as I said, it is a systemic problem. What we need is more growth. What do we need more growth? Because austerity policies by themselves cannot solve this fiscal problem. because austerity reduces tax receipts, so increases the deficit, and austerity reduces GDP, which is the denominator in the debt-GDP ratio. And when we evaluate the viability of the debt position of a country, we look at that particular ratio. So austerity reduces the denominator to the extent that it produces wider deficits and increases the denominator, leading the debt-GDP ratio to an explosively rising trend, necessitating haircuts, which are very, very highly opposed by Germany. So we're in a dead end. It's an impasse. We need more growth. Austerity is one thing, but should be complemented by other policies. Now, what these other policies are? First of all, there are a couple of things, ladies and gentlemen, which can be done within the context of the existing treaties and institutions. The first thing, which is easy, is that fiscal policy should not be the same in all countries. They cannot all countries follow austerity. Stronger countries, fiscally more sound countries, could relax a bit the budgetary policies. This is what the IMF is saying, this is what the OECD is saying, this is what President Obama is saying. Only Germans say no. This is not an indication that things are right. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the southern countries need a demand push. How? Through what is called a Marshall Plan for the South, to do what the Americans have done 50 years ago, half a century ago, to revive the European economies after the chaos of the Second World War. The same should be done for the southern countries of Europe. The third thing, always within the context of existing policies, is to allow the ECB, or encourage the ECB, I don't know what is the right word, the proper word to use, to follow more aggressive monetary policies. This, again, is not a novelty, you know, because if you look at the United States Federal Reserve Bank, if you look at the Bank of Japan after the election of the new Prime Minister, if you look at the Bank of England, you will see that most intelligent central banks follow aggressive monetary policies, both in terms of interest rates and both in terms of unconventional monetary policy measures. To do what? To increase inflation, to avoid deflation, and so revive the economy through this indirect means. Because if inflation is 1%, it can easily go up to 2% or to 2.5% without people becoming terrified. So these are the couple obvious things of macroeconomic management which can be done immediately, now, to revive growth. Now let's go to the most difficult part. Things which need either treaty change or they need institutional decisions. The first is Eurobonds. Look, if you have all this differentiation between Greek bonds and German bonds and Finnish bonds and Portuguese bonds, you get speculation because investors get attracted by the strong bonds, the spreads rise, and so borrowing costs are raised within the Eurozone, and when you have an excessive cost of money, you cannot get economic recovery going. This is elementary economics, which is, of course, strange how some people in the European Union are failing to grasp. This is essential. The Eurobonds, partial, controlled, under many conditions, should be part of the game. Second institutional key, banking union. If you have banks which are larger than countries, and which was the case not only in Iceland, but also in Ireland and in Belgium and other countries, you cannot impose on the state the obligation to recapitalize failed banks. You have to spread the cost. So banking union involves a resolution authority to spread the cost, involves strong supervision, centralized, to avoid governments making favors to bankers who are friendly to them, and you need a deposit scheme to retain deposits in the bank or the failing banks. So that's a second major institutional reform. And the third, which is, of course, the bigger one, the grander one, the more sort of ambitious one, is political reform, which is necessary not just to become more beautiful, I mean to say that we have a federation in Europe, but you need to have more democratically accountable institutions with a stronger European Parliament, with an EU Commission turning into a government with an elected chairman and so on, so as to allow the centralized institutions of Europe, by being democratically accountable, to be stronger and more effective. I finish, these are my last words, more effective in coordinating economic policies. All these things are necessary conditions to complement the inevitable, enormous effort that should be undertaken by the individual countries themselves. Thank you
very much. Just a quick question. There was one buzzword there and one buzzword that was missing. The buzzword that was missing was structural reform, and the buzzword that is there is the Marshall Plan. I have two questions there. Structural reform, especially in the case of Greece. The OECD put out a study in 2011 stating that Greece has, or there are huge difficulties in Greece, interconnecting different ministries, gathering the data with the data system, basically making sense of all the information, etc., etc. So this is a deep structural reform thing, shrinking the public sector, strengthening the private sector, etc., etc. That part was missing, so it would be great if we had a short word on that.
It is fully right.
And the second one was the issue of Marshall Plan. It's become such a buzzword in Europe, but the Marshall Plan was implemented when Europe had just gone through a near-death situation, when most of Europe was totally destroyed, and it was clear that they had to be built up. Now, to put it roughly, now we need to build down in certain sectors, especially in the public sector. This is not about recreating from the scratch something that has happened in Europe, but it is about structural reform in many countries that is different. It's different in Italy than in Spain, which has had a banking bubble. In Italy, it is about not as effective legal system. In Greece, it's about competitiveness in medium-sized, if existent, enterprises, etc., etc. Now, where would you put a Marshall Plan in when it's not about restructuring or rebuilding, but rather restructuring? I still don't get that.
I will answer both of these questions. First of all, the question of the structural reforms. You're absolutely right, and the OECD reports are very accurate, because in the decade after the accession of Greece into the EU, Greece ceased to reform. This is the problem, essentially. And let me open a very small parenthesis to explain this. The problem with the South, not only Greece, but Spain, Portugal, Italy, and so on, is that once they entered into the Eurozone, they felt so happy, the peoples there, that they have a strong currency, low interest rates, low inflation, stability, and guarantees for everything, that they forgot the efforts to reform and improve. They've done exactly the opposite of what the Germans and the Northern have done, which is to accelerate the reform process once they were into the currency union. So the last decade was a lost decade for Greece in reforms. Reforms stopped, and they produced the unacceptable situation described by the OECD. Now, after the election of the last government, things are becoming better. And if you see the Commission reports and the Troika reports last month, they note that substantial reform, and Monsieur Leterme might confirm this, has been performed in the last 12 months. So this is important. It is like you say, but things are improving. Now, Marshall Plan. Of course, Marshall Plan is, as we politicians like to say, a rhetorical expression. The current Marshall Plan will have nothing to do with the previous one, because it will affect just 4 countries and not 30 countries, as was the case after the Second World War. And secondly, it will be partly grants and partly loans, guaranteed loans, because grants will have to go just to specific sectors of infrastructure where needs are obvious in Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Italy, and there will be no waste in that. And loans could be loans by the EIB to Greek banks, which would be designed, earmarked just for small and medium-sized enterprises, which are closing by the thousands, with a guarantee of a European authority. So a small and smart Marshall Plan is definitely part of the picture. But you agree that we should forget about the dimensions the Marshall Plan had after the end of the Second World War.
Thank you. Mr. Leterme, I could see that you were waiting to answer some of the issues being brought up during the panel. So please, you have the last word before we go into the Q&A session.
Thank you very much. Before entering into the subject, I would like, of course, to thank the organizers for having us here. Maybe also seize the opportunity to pay a tribute to the leadership here in Latvia. We are engaging in accession talks. Latvia will be a member state of the OECD, and we are very glad to welcome Latvia. And last but not least, congratulations to Croatia, not only to the government, but to the whole of the country for the membership of the European Union. Central question will the European Union still be a global player? I think it obviously is a global player. It was said before, it's one of the best places to be in the world. It has a very important stabilizing role on the continent, and from that point of view, I think the role the European Union played as a global player was most definitely at the internal stage. And thirdly, of course, in the domains where there was a clear choice for integration, we are really a global player. Free trade, with the very specific tasking of the European Commission, is an example where we are a global player. Also, the competition law, the internal competition rules are applied to very important companies. So, yes, we are today a global player. I would be a little bit less optimistic than the colleagues to answer the question for the future. I think we sometimes take it for granted that we are a global player. But for the moment, friends and colleagues, you see a world developing at a very high speed, a very important pace, and you see that other emerging economies are becoming a global player and sometimes have more courage to deserve the position as a global player. So then entering into the subject from an economic point of view, first maybe in the short run give some positive news. We issued, I think it was yesterday or the day before, our interim economic outlook, and we can say as an OECD that normally the worst part of the crisis is behind us. We will have the second half of 2013, we will have again some limited growth, and next year normally the situation will improve. But that being said, I think we have to be conscious that we are confronted with two very important challenges as a European Union. Because these small figures of economic growth cannot hide that since 2008, on average, we lost 3% of our growth, of our wealth in the European Union. For the moment, most of the members of the European Union and Eurozone members are amongst the worst performing member states of the OECD still today. And so in terms of unemployment, in terms of the lack of a real banking union, in terms of other domains, there is still a lot of work to do, and we cannot say that we have overcome the difficulties. More important is that we are not following the pace of development, because already before the crisis of 2008, we had, on average, growth figures which were lower than not only in the emerging economies, but also the more ripe economies, member states of the OECD economic blocs that also are mature economies. So what to do to try to improve the situation, what to do to seize the opportunities, to unleash potential and still to be a global player in the future. I think you can give three categories of answer. The first is, and Valdis Dombrovskis already has mentioned it, I think we have to unleash in a more decisive way, the existing potential of the European Union. Indeed, in terms of internal market, today the trade between European Union member states and member states of the Eurozones is lower than approximately 2/3 to 3/4 of what it is in the United States of America. Even in manufactured goods, in very simple goods, you see that the internal market, as of today, is not really functioning. I remember from my time when we were in the presidency of the European Union, one of the main dossiers was to try to build up a positive decision on the European patent. How is it possible? In 2010, we still had to solve a problem of having a common European patent, talking about innovation, R&D, and so on. Just mentioning this to show you that there are still lots of possibilities to unleash the enormous potential of having this internal market and having this European integration. Other example is the non-existing European labor market. We could elaborate a lot on that, but we don't have the time. But first is to put order in the European economic household and to unleash all the potential you already have in the framework of the existing treaty. Secondly, a very important challenge when you look at the European Union from a more global perspective, and this is really striking also for me, who has been in charge of a country and been active in politics in Europe for 15, 20 years. When you look at the European economy and society as a whole, you see that it is really a problem of capacity to adapt to a very fast changing of the world, and even changing of the basic rules according to which the economy is played. We are defending in a very effective way some vested interests, but in between we see that we don't seize all the opportunities of new developments. I give you an example of today. We have published in St. Petersburg and presented to the G20 leaders today our report on global value chain. Global value chains is the key concept of the modern economy. It means that most of the products and services don't really have a nationality anymore. That almost all services and products that are marketed and sold globally are composed by parts which are produced in different countries. And to be really well performing in an economy based on global value chains, for instance, facilitating import is as so important as facilitating export, because you need the intermediate goods and services to complete them, to be able to sell them with added value. And so the conception of a product and the marketing of a product, the trade of a product, is really very important in terms of added value. And I have the feeling that sometimes in Europe we still think, faced with this very fast-changing world economy, that we here in the European Union, we are producing a goods and service with lots of added value, with technicalities, the complicated products, and that elsewhere in the world they will produce, because of the lower wages and salaries, they will produce the very simple services and goods. World has changed. Even the most sophisticated products are conceived, are produced in countries which we still estimate as being the low income and low wages and salary countries. So put order in our household. Secondly, find ways to adapt our decision making and our strategy to the very fast changing economic outlook and the very fast pace of economic development. Thirdly, in terms of being a global player, it means it's necessary, it's urgent to show more openness. It strikes me that, notwithstanding the fact that we were first to strike a deal with South Korea, but that globally spoken, during the last decades, we have not been at the forefront of demanding for more free trade, for openness of our economies. It were the United States that were engaging in lots of free trade talks, and the WTO being in difficulties. This is of key importance for well-performing economies to participate very assertively in the world economy. And I think there's still a lot of work to do. Last but not least, of course, if we want to be a global player in the future, we will have to deserve it also in terms of security policy, in speaking with one voice on the global level when it comes to take positions in terms of crises and in terms of engagement of power on a global level. So that would be my answer to your fundamental question.
Perhaps one more word on a specific issue. Youth unemployment has reached dramatic levels in many countries, especially in the southern countries. Now the question will be, is there something specific that the EU should do on this problem? Because here's a generation that not only loses its entrance into the workforce, but in the long run will cause problems if this is taking longer because of demographic pension issues, retirement issues. I know that's a far call yet, but also because they, in a constantly and ever faster developing and innovating world, they lose the opportunity or the possibility to catch up on and constantly enhancing the qualifications in their respective fields. So what would you recommend to do on this, as I see it, one of the most pressing problems for the European Union today?
First of all, acknowledge that this is really a scandalous situation. It's a not sustainable situation when you see in some countries that obviously young people under 25, 40, 50, 60% are unemployed. This leads not only to economic problems, social problems, but even political problems and I think problems in terms of legitimacy of systems. I think the number one point is that we have to put our economies again on a sustainable path of economic growth. The second remark I would like to make is that you point to the European Union when it comes to solve the problem of unemployment. What I would like to say as a former member of the European Council, you cannot ask from the European Union what the European Union cannot deliver because of a lack of competences and a lack of budgetary means. The budgetary means of the European Union are 1% GDP. So in terms of relaunching the economy, this is a very limited budget. It's the free space for building up strategies to tackle the labor market issues, well, the amount of money when you count it per head is maximum the price of one pizza a year. So how can you expect the European Union to do what member states sometimes haven't been doing during some decades when there's a lack of money and there's a lack of competences? So first, we have to have economic growth. Secondly, the member states have to give the possibilities to the European Union to act in this field. And thirdly, the most important, I think, by tackling the problem of mismatches between education, vocational training on the one hand, and the demand on the labor market on the other hand, and in improving the mobility on the labor market, I think that we have to build a real European labor market, because for the moment we have at the best national labor markets, and let's be fair enough to see it. In fact, we have regional and even sub-regional labor markets without enough mobility from the viewpoint of the people that are unemployed, but also a lack of mobility in terms of companies, big companies and SMEs that sometimes don't look far enough when they are talking about hiring people and looking for the right people.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the time to put in your questions. I'm sure you have plenty of them. Make yourself seen to me. If you'd quickly introduce yourself and ask your precise and short questions to one specific panelist you would like to answer. Yes, the gentleman here.
Hamid Lajavardi to Mr. Yves Leterme. There are certain imbalances, disparities, and divisions that need to be addressed for the long term. Growth, well-being of Europe. I'll list 4 of them very quickly. Negative population growth, the demographic trends of most of Europe. The role of women, specifically equal pay and equal opportunity. Integration of minorities and immigrants. And last, cultural and economic divisions between the North, South, East, and West. Any one of them, I'll be happy to hear.
I'd suggest that we collect a few questions, because if we address all of them, I'm sorry for the other panels. We'll be sitting here until tomorrow. Are there more questions in the auditorium? And please wave and ask, because I'm sure there'll be plenty of them. And don't be shy, because there's tons of what you can ask here. Yes, Todd.
Todd Lindbergh from the Hoover Institution. Just to broaden the conversation a bit, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is the successful completion of the transatlantic trade agreement, and why?
That would be a good question to answer now. And perhaps, Mr. Dombrovskis, you would like to start with it. The TTIP, how important is it for Europe?
Well, as regards transatlantic free trade agreement, I think it's quite important, and of course we know that those negotiations have started. Latvia, from its parts, supports a speedy path of those negotiations and concluding them in due time. I was talking about factors affecting EU competitiveness, and indeed some 2 years ago several heads of state and government wrote a letter to the European Commission indicating different of those issues, and actually facilitating free trade was one of those issues. And there were also examples that just completing this free trade agreement with US, I cannot remember now those specific figures, but it's adding again some few percentage points to the EU's GDP. So certainly it's quite important that we move forward, especially that if we are to agree on this agreement, this agreement could become some kind of international benchmark for a number of other agreements, whereas if we fail in this agreement, others will be setting benchmarks for us. It's also something. Remember that we are not the only global players anymore. There are quite a few global players, and they are also negotiating and probably setting up their standards.
Mr. Leterme, can I ask a follow-up on this? Because there are some issues that were negotiated about time and again. And now everybody tells me that the US president and the Europeans are more determined than ever to overcome some also delicate issues. And it's not only about chlorine chickens, it's about genetically modified food, and it might be about data protection. So where do you see the most difficult stumbling stones? And how optimistic are you about concluding these negotiations and having the chance to set standards in the world of trade barriers that could probably not be set in a Doha round, but could be set by the TTIP?
I first of all would like to agree with what the Latvian Prime Minister said. It is important as such in terms of economic growth, the potential growth we can unleash with striking a deal between the United States and the European Union. And secondly, given the importance of the American-European economy, it's very clear that it will be standard setting. If we are successful in this agreement, we will set a standard for the whole of the global economy. Very typical for these negotiations, and I'm not a European politician, I'm not an American politician, but it's very interesting is that the core of the debate is not about tariffs, but is about all kinds of measures, all kinds of the fact that markets are closed to competition because of rules, regulations, in terms of investment, in terms of intellectual property, in terms of tendering, and so on. When it comes to the more sensitive issues, I'm not in a position to criticize or to support some positions. The only thing I would like to say is that at the end, when you see the development of the history of trade on a world level, on a global level, and also between the United States and the European Union, the fears that sometimes were there at the start of negotiations, when you see the outcome after some years of agreements and what the impact was in reality, that sometimes the fears were not, the concerns were not really justified, and so the reluctance from the European side in some domains, and you named some of them. I think I can understand them. I'm also an elected politician. I have been an elected politician. I know the sensitiveness of some of these issues. But in the long run, I think that sometimes these concerns are not justified. And some of them, I would characterize them as what we are very good in Europe, the defense of vested interests, which endangers, which handicaps us, endangers the possibility to really seize the opportunities of the future. So let's be very realistic in defending vested interests. Let us maybe more look at opportunities in opening markets.
Let me pick up one part of the question that was asked before, and which is a very important one, the question about demography. Perhaps really starting quickly from right to left, how decisive is this factor, and what can be done to remedy? Because obviously most of the emerging economies are very young countries. The United States has one very big advantage. It is a pretty young country, has lots of immigration. When we look at Europe's demography, then we see a quite different picture. How much do you see this touching on the issue of migration and a much more liberal migration policy when it comes to the European Union? Mr. Papantoniou, probably would be right to ask you, because Greece is an entry point for many illegal migrants into the European Union. And by taking up the demographic issue, I never understood why we don't try to enhance competitiveness in Europe with a much more clever and much more liberal immigration policy. So what's your view on this?
Well, my feeling on this is the following. I fully agree. The first point is that I fully agree that immigration is a very substantial part of the success of the American society and the American economy. And so European economies have an vested interest in opening up their frontiers. Now, the problem is that we live in a recession environment, and the addition of new unemployed people creates social tensions. And one should not forget that that's also raised political questions, because in Greece, for the first time in the last 50 years, we do have a neo-Nazi party, which is based on racism, which is getting in the polls 12 to 14%. So there are risks in this, but generally speaking, the trend in Greece in the last, say, 10 years has been to open up more and more, and I would say that about 15% of our labor force now is composed by foreigners. So we try as well as we can, but we cannot go beyond certain points because Parliament will not vote for them. And secondly, the political system, the democratic system, is put at some danger.
Mr. Leterme?
Well, first on the demography, it's very clear that it plays a very important role. And I think also in this region, in this country and in this region, it plays a very important role. To say it roughly, if I'm right, I think I'm right, today the average age of an Indian and an African is 27. The average age of an American and a Chinese is 37, and the average age of a European and a Japanese is 47. So this is the whole of the problem of greening and aging, which is, spread very unevenly all over the world. And of course, a positive demography adds to the potential in terms of economic growth. The reason why the United States, one of the reasons why the United States still have a better performance record in terms of economic growth is related to the immigration policy. Second, so yes, it is very important, it is key, and I know that European countries are working on policies, or trying to improve their policies in that field. Second remark is that the problem related to demography and migration is that in the European Union, and this is caused by very specific reasons linked to the recent history, migration, instead as being part of the solution, is felt as being part of the problem in societies, even leading to populism and to problems in terms of the functioning of the democracy. This has to see with a lack of integration. And so you have to have immigration. You have to have, first of all, an internal European migration. Think about the single labor market and the mobility on the labor market. So trying to enhance the internal migration within the European Union. But yes, the European Union, to have a sustainable path of growth in this future, will need migration, people coming from outside the European Union, to fill the gaps caused in lots of countries, partly close the gaps caused in lots of countries by the aging of the population. But I think it's only sustainable under the condition that there is a strong policy in terms of social cohesion, integration, with rights for the people that come to Europe, but also with some, there are also some things which should be compulsory, like learning the language, the habits, learning the capacities on the labor market, integrate in the European societies.
Further questions? Yes, go ahead, please.
Yves College, member of the Latvian Parliament. The United States paid for the last Marshall Plan. Who would pay for this one?
The question goes to Ms. Okay.
Don't forget that Germany and the European Union, the Eurozone countries of the North, are paying very heavily for bailing out over-indebted countries. My proposal is rather simple. Instead of continuing bailing out Greece and Portugal and covering their debt costs, it's much more productive to devote resources to investment. And they will spend less on helping investment and to reviving growth in the South than continuously letting these countries drifting away and covering their debts. It is in their long-term interest, as much as it was in the United States in interest to pay before the war. And also, let me remind the answer I gave to the previous question, that we talk about a much more limited fund. we talk about a small part in grants, and the larger part will be loans guaranteed by European authorities. So I don't think that it will worsen. It will, in fact, ease the fiscal problem the northern countries are facing in terms of saving the south.
Can I quickly follow up with a fool's question? Can we always distinguish between bailing out and investing in some cases?
Well, I distinguish it because, you know, bailing out involves covering bad debt that has grown out of waste and tax evasion and so on. Helping investors and helping private or public investment builds for the future. So I think there's a substantial difference between the two.
Your questions? I have one more question. Because it's been mentioned here in the context of migration policy, and I would also like to ask you, Mr. Milanović and Mr. Dombrovskis. In spring next year, we'll have elections for the European Parliament. And it's been said, and probably rightfully so, that the European Parliament has to be strengthened within the European institutions. Who would have anything against it? That's quite sure. And probably it has grown into a role of greater strength over the last 2 or 3 years anyway. But what we see in many countries, Hungary, also Greece, the Netherlands, and some other countries, is populist parties gaining strength. And we might see a scenario where populist anti-EU parties are being voted into the European Parliament. I would like to hear your take on this, Mr. Milanović, and then yours, Mr. Dombrovskis, how you see that and what kind of problems you might have to face if this is going to happen.
Well, that has been around for some time, and what goes around comes around. But European Union and in that respect, European Parliament as well, is specific and unique in a way that it is the only political entity with a representative body in which you can plead the dissolution of the entity. And it's not punishable, there is complete impunity about that, and it's actually natural. We have lambasted, lately in Croatia, we had first extraordinary elections for the European Parliament, the first ever. The turnout was splendid, some 19% of the electorate turned out to vote. But actually, the Eurosceptic entered the parliament, and from the benches, he would plead for the dissolution of the parliament, and it's completely legitimate. If it were to happen in, Germany, Croatia, United States, it will be, I guess, illegal, because that's the bedrock of constitutional system. It's simply different. So it don't worry me. It doesn't worry me that much. Another point I wanted to make about migrations. Look, it's a very delicate balance. So there are small countries, big countries. Big countries can withstand much more. Small countries have to think hard. What is the threshold? What is the level above which they are, simply at peril? And I'm speaking that as a liberal left politician, socially liberal, economically liberal, but simply there are dangers. And you have to reckon, you have to think of that in advance before you cross the threshold. I don't see necessary correlation between young working force, actually it's not that I don't see it, it's not seen statistically, and economic success and growth. Germany has been demographically stagnant, is that right, for years, and actually declining a bit, hence success. I mean, it's all about structure of the economy, it's all about so many factors and inputs that there is no panacea, there is no one solution for all. America is totally different example, but China will certainly, in all likelihood, get old in economic terms before it gets rich. Because the one-child policy is the effects of the one-child policy are coming of age, and it's here now. I mean, the fresh input of young labor force into labor market has come to stall. It's not a case anymore.
But the fact that one big player on the global market is getting older faster than we are doesn't help us much in the sector of competitiveness, does it?
That France is growing old?
No, that the fact that a global player, who's one of the most important global players in the economy right now, namely China, is getting older much quicker than the Europeans might, which they aren't, and that they might run into some problems when it comes to pensions, etc., doesn't help Europe much. You know, it doesn't. What does it have to do with Europe's competitiveness? Really, there might be one competitor less, yes, an important one, but still the problem's there.
My point is that we might sometimes be overstating the importance of demographics. It functions differently in different places, even in Europe. And as long as we haven't completed internal market, as long as its full completion is still pending, I mean, transatlantic trade agreement does not come as panacea. There is much room here still, not resources not nearly tapped on that need to be tapped. It's in Europe. And it would cater primarily to the export-oriented economies like German. But I don't know how Latvia would necessarily profit or be exposed from that transatlantic trade agreement. It's a minuscule effect.
Mr. Dombrovskis, you just wanted to add something and then we go back into questions?
Just to answer a question on those European Parliament elections, also as a former member of European Parliament. Well, I think one of the issues is really what EU is concentrating on its agenda. And really, if EU will be concentrating on those issues which are in people's minds, which are mainly about jobs and growth, I think it's possible to ensure that people follow those policies. And I think, for example, this youth unemployment initiative, which is now promoted by the EU, is an excellent example of what kind of policies we should be moving forward with. But of course, risks are there. If we are not concentrating on those jobs and growth issues, and if we are not ensuring that people see the perspective of this, there are quite substantial risks that people in South will vote for populist parties because they will not feel bailed out enough, or bailout conditions are too harsh, or there's no Marshall Plan for them, or whatever. People in North will vote for populist parties because those governments are wasting their money on those profligate Southerners and so on. So risks are certainly there, and really the best way to deal with those economic problems is to concentrate on those issues which are promoting economic growth. Of course, also there we still need to agree, because some would say that more deficit spending will lead to more growth, and others will say no, dealing with those competitiveness factors will lead to more growth. But nevertheless, that's what we need to concentrate on.
Thank you. There's one more question here, and then there's another one at the end of the row next to Mr. Kennedy. Yes, if you pass on the mic. Thanks.
I'm Artus Lange from the Latvian Parliament, Foreign Affairs and European Affairs Committee. 5-6 years ago, I was in Washington. We had a meeting between American institute directors and the European institute directors, and we were shocked by what the Americans said. They said, well, look, in 30 years' time, China will be number one. This is the topic we're talking about. China will be number one, America will be number two, and the third country will be India. And then we asked, well, where will Europe be? And they said, well, we don't know. It depends on how Europe gets its act together. And that's exactly what we're talking about. Is Europe getting its act together? Of course, the emerging countries like China, India, Brazil, Russia, they have stalled now in the economic growth. We know that. They're slowing down. But still, the prognosis doesn't look good. So my question would be, is this scenario, will that come about in 10, 20, or 30 years? And the other question is, by the way, how did the Americans know this? Europeans, we never knew anything about this, that the world would change so quickly. That's an interesting question too. But then the second question is, okay, I'm in Latvia, I represent Latvia, and next year we join the euro. And then what's the first job we have to do? We have to help bail out Greece a third time. And look at the pensions in Greece, 3-4 times higher than in Latvia. How are you going to sell this to the people in Latvia?
I guess we pass on this question and to your Prime Minister and take the second one.
Thank you. Giga Bokeria, NSC Georgia. There seems to be at least a consensus here, the discussion about competitiveness as a problem, but I haven't heard, and I'm sorry if I missed the word deregulation. Do you think there can be a trend as a conclusion that there's a competitiveness problem, that it be a growing consensus about reducing the role of the state in Europe, deregulating really, including deregulating labor regulations? Is there a chance of wider European trend on that? Thank you so much.
And that is a question you would like to be answered by?
All of the panelists, if it's possible. Sorry. But the Prime Ministers first and foremost, of course.
Why did I think that? Mr. Dombrovskis, would you like to answer the question that was asked first? Are we going to bail out Greece again? And are we going to get our act together? And I actually like you to answer this question because you're the optimist in the round.
Well, on the first question, certainly, or the second, basically on Latvia bailing out Greece and still having much lower average wages or average pensions. And it is a problem, and I would like also our Greek colleagues to think about this. Our people are earning less. Should they be paying to your people? Of course it's a problem. But nevertheless, when we were joining the Eurozone, we understand that we are joining the Eurozone as a package deal, so to say, that we join Eurozone with all its important conditions, and our contribution to the ESM, to the European Stability Mechanism, is part of this package. And when discussing Latvia's Eurozone accession, of course, we were dealing with what are the cons for the economy, what we will earn through more investment in Latvia, how it will reduce interest rates, how it will help to reduce currency conversion costs, and at the same time we were thinking of this con. Yes, we have to pay to the ESM, but if we are joining to Eurozone, well, yes, we have to accept that it also comes with contributions to ESM. So that's probably the answer for the first question. Then on the second one on can Europe get its act together? And I would say Europe is getting its act together because to think if Europe is getting its act together, it's worth understanding why Europe and Eurozone came into trouble. And I think one of the major reasons was that there were no serious control and sanction mechanisms within Eurozone. Although were some control and sanction mechanisms until some early 2000s, and they were scrapped for some reasons. And since then, there was a free ride. And then what you can do, if countries are not following Maastricht criteria and nobody is caring about this, some 10 years later you arrive, or even less than 10 years later, you arrive at the serious trouble, exactly what was happening. And so what now has been done through the number of governance initiatives, those sanction and control mechanisms had been reinstated or instated in a different form, but in the case there is much more attention paid to the issues of fiscal discipline and to the economic governance first and foremost in Eurozone countries. And it's quite clear, if we are to share the same currency, we have to follow the same rules. And moreover, if we are to share our risks, we are even more bound to follow the same rules. And that's what pretty much all Eurozone countries and a number of other countries have committed, for example, in Fiscal Discipline Treaty or Fiscal Compact. There are a number of governance initiatives like so-called six-pack, two-pack. Before that it was Euro Plus Pact, and so on and so on. So all those initiatives are going into the same direction, and I think they are going into the right direction. But what we need to concentrate right now is those competitiveness issues, which I mentioned in the beginning of this panel. And I also mentioned, probably I didn't use the word deregulation, but use the word reducing the administrative burden, which is basically the same concept put in another words, which is certainly part of the problems that Europe's labor markets, Europe number of activities are heavily regulated, and they are much more heavily regulated than in other major economies, say US. And we will need to do something also about this.
Mr. Leterme, I really do not like to introduce into a lively debate an argument that is the killer of all arguments, called TINA. There is no alternative, but still. Is there any other option for Europe than getting its act together?
I think if the ambition is to still be a global player in the future, there's no alternative. It's very clear. There has to be more integration. But one of the main problems we have with the European Union is that, and it's very easy to understand, once again, is the pace of decision making and the pace of development. I mean, we are living in a society, globally spoken, which develops very fast. And our very complicated, complex, and it's normal, it's obvious that our complex way of decision making with all our procedures not always is adapted to the very fast developing of problems. I remember I was sitting in the Élysée as a Prime Minister of Belgium when we had the first impact on the banks of the Lehman Brothers dossier. And with a couple of friends, the Benelux Prime Ministers, we were asking to Mrs. Sarkozy, Mrs. Merkel, let's talk about a banking union and let's talk about Eurobonds. And very rightly, the colleagues of the bigger countries said, well, you may be right, but that's not the moment now. We won't talk about this. We first have to tackle the problem of next week, the week after, and we have to find ad hoc solutions for the problems we are confronted with. And you see that we are now talking 2013, September 2013, and we are there. Like Mr. Dombrovskis said, a couple of very important decisions already have been taken on the fiscal compact, on the six-pack, on the two-pack, and so on. But it's very often a matter of pace. So there is no alternative, and the key issue is how fast will it go? And of course there are lots of other aspects. It would take us too long to elaborate on this. But I would like to answer very quickly on some of the remarks that have been made. First of all, about the forecast of the development, the honorable member of the Latvian Parliament, I would like to advertise our website. We know perfectly in terms of demography, in terms of economic development, in terms of CO2 emissions and so on, with unchanged policies, where we will stand in 2050. We have on our website, OECD.org, we have all figures, and you can see, without policy changes, what will be the result of what is happening now. Second element, of course, tackling red tape. Of course, tackling bureaucracy and all kinds of regulation. But I would say that we have been very good in Europe in finding all kinds of rules and regulations for less important issues, and we are not as performing when it comes to very important issues. And there is also a lack of regulation. There is also a lack of rules. There is a level playing field for companies, for multinational companies, for lots of activities, for the impact of our economic development on the environment, and this level playing field is the globe, is the world. And what we are missing is common standard, common rules. We are now living in a period of a breakthrough, for instance, in the rules we need to tackle the tax havens and to come to a situation of fair taxes. But there are so many other domains where there is a need for common rules and there is a need for inclusive multilateralism with legally binding agreements on basic elements which make the economy run. Even Barcelona or Bayern Munich, they cannot play a good football match, soccer match, without a good referee and without common rules. And the same is happening in the world. We cannot let the economy develop on a global level and free the trade and so on without having common rules that are applied in a decisive way.
And since this panel ends now with mentioning my two favorite soccer clubs, and since we're approaching the coffee break very soon, I'd really like to thank you very much. It's interesting indeed that lively discussions on the European Union and competitiveness, you want to add something.
I wanted to say something, not to add to okay. What you said, and it's very briefly. I hate starting with that very briefly. It's usually the phrase of the liars, but it's one issue that we haven't touched upon at all, and we've been through a vast array of issues, and it's the education. I'm sorry about that, because that's something that's very often the source of all our self-delusions about the role of education and how does it serve and what is its added value, because we see throughout Europe that actually the formal percentage of the college-educated people means absolutely nothing. Austria, by any standard, just one example, star performer, as rich as the United States, has, I think, the lowest percentage of the college-educated, tertiary-educated people in Europe, or the second from the bottom. Germany is not much higher, though.
I know.
Southern countries, except for Italy, have seen their stellar years in performing in terms of the output of the college-educated youngsters in wane. So that's a very important topic for discussion. Let's not waste money on that if we don't know what to do and where to go.
Thanks. But
one word?
A quick word. Yeah, of course.
I would like to, first of all, to assure the gentleman behind from the Latvian Parliament that if he looks at the 2013 figures for pensions in Greece, he will be impressed by how close to Latvian pensions are. And the second thing, is to add on an optimistic note. When I first worked at the OECD 30 years ago, England was the sick man of Europe before Thatcher. Then Germany was the sick man of Europe before Schroeder. So now Europe is the sick man of the world. I hope that this will not last very long.
But obviously one that hasn't tapped into its own resources enough, and that seems to be the very optimistic message of this panel, that there is still enough where we have to and tap into. Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you very much, dear panelists, for this panel, and we'll regather here at 5:30.